When Tony and Catherine Butterfield put their children to bed on April 18, 2020, little did they know that time would be the last.
This is a case that started with a 911 call that came out to law enforcement in the middle of the night, about 1:15 in the morning.
The couple was startled out of bed when a masked intruder broke into their home.
They were able to, both the forensic evidence that they gathered, the other additional evidence that they gathered, they were able to identify a suspect.
Investigators say the intruder is this man, Albert Johnson, a convicted criminal also known as Psycho Al. Police say at that point, Johnson's motivation was stealing.
What the suspect indicated, that he was feeling financial stress. He went to their house knowing thinking that they had money to get money, basically to rob them.
Authorities say Johnson left with $20 and 2 cell phones, but things escalated when he returned.
Once he got to the car, he realized that he had dropped his keys and that he didn't have them. He kicked through the door, and at that point, he didn't have his face mask on.
Detectives say Tony Butterfield recognized Johnson, addressing him by name and asking why. Police say the violent attack happened next.
Tony was defending himself and his family and Catherine, and he had a knife, and there was a struggle. And at that point, he stabbed Mr. Johnson. And Mr. Johnson says in the statement that he gave to the police that it was very painful and he shot him because he got stabbed by him, but he had the weapon.
Officials say Johnson is a convicted felon who was prohibited from possessing a firearm, yet had one that night when he invaded the couple's home.
As he shoots Tony, his wife is also coming to the aid of her husband, and he shoots her because, as he says, she's screaming and she won't shut up.
Shockingly, the children, ages 6, 4, and 6 months, slept through the whole ordeal.
There'll never be a substitute for that loss, but they have an incredible family structure and network of loving grandparents and aunts and uncles and so forth who have rallied around the lives of these 3 very young children in this very tragic time.
Johnson is facing charges of aggravated murder and other offenses. His wife, Sina Johnson, is accused of obstructing justice for allegedly lying to police about seeing her husband on the day of the crime.
Unbelievable story. And the shocking part is that he's leaving, but he left his keys or dropped his keys, had to return, and then revealed his identity. Let's bring in Julie Grant. Julie, that's the one part of this, right? It's a home invasion. It's over, but the keys are still in the house, or he dropped his keys, so he had to return to where he had just taken everything. And that's where he returns, but he reveals his identity at that point.
Exactly. You hit the nail on the head. Perhaps that couple would still be alive today if the factual situation didn't unfold the way investigators say it did with him forgetting the keys and then forgetting the mask. And he was someone that was known to Tony Butterfield, and how police learned, Vinny, how they learned about Tony Butterfield recognizing Albert Johnson was through Albert Johnson. He gave a confession. They read him his warnings pursuant to Miranda, and he agreed to sit down and tell them what happened. And he said that he recognized him when he came back, addressed him by name, as a matter of fact. And I think the most painful part of that story to tell was when he asked why. And at that point, that's when the attack ensued. And according to officials, and here we are today with those 3 children growing up without their parents, Vinny.
And you talk about the confession. You've got the confession, but you've got forensic evidence. There's a video as well, right? I mean, this is a case where prosecutors have I don't want to say that cliche mountain of evidence, but this is beyond a mountain of evidence. If you've got video, confession, plus all the forensics.
Oh, absolutely. If there ever was a case where there was a mountain of evidence, you are right. It is this one with the Butterfields as the victims. And that video you're talking about is one the public hasn't seen yet. It's not being released. The only time we will get to look at is when it's played in court and then becomes part of the public record. Then, of course, at that point, that's something that we can all view. But at this point, investigators are the only ones viewing it. But what they've shared with us is that this home that the Butterfields owned had security video on the inside, which they tell us is pretty rare for what they see in Salt Lake County. But this home had it. It was working that night, and they tell us that it captured defendant Albert Johnson going into the home, waking the couple up out of bed, leading them out of their bedroom, all of that for the burglary, the robbery, the kidnapping, all of these things that officials say took place before he left. And then he had to come back. And again, surveillance video captured the events unfolding. We know that some things apparently happened outside of the home as well. But we do know that that video exists. And it was partially through that video, as we understand it, that police were able to make that identification so quickly of Albert Johnson, who fled to California, by the way.
Now, from my perspective, really the only unanswered question at this point, based upon what it seems is overwhelming evidence, is death penalty or no death penalty. And I know the DA spoke about that. Let's take a listen.
It is too premature for me to make a speculation about that. What I can say is this is an aggravated murder, and as such, the death penalty is certainly a part of that equation. And in our process, what we do is we go through what's called a preliminary hearing, the presentment of our preliminary evidence to make sure that we have sufficient evidence for the right person to warrant the holding and binding over that person to be held accountable for these offenses. The way our legislature has set it up is that after your preliminary hearing, there is a period of time within which the prosecution then has a time to fully deliberate and to analyze all the information and to make the election for the capital offense if we're going to pursue that. And the way it was set up is because this is a very serious, of course, responsibility. You want to be very deliberate and deliberative about it. And rather than simply saying, yes, that's what we're going to do, there's a thoughtfulness that is involved in that process with the gravity of the decision that you're making.
And I think that's going to be the huge decision in this case, Julian, and I think will impact whether or not we get a trial or not here.
Yes, absolutely. And as you can see, you can tell District Attorney Sim Gill, very intelligent man, very compassionate, very seasoned prosecutor. And he's the first one to acknowledge that this is a very weighty decision that has to be made slowly and carefully after consuming all of the evidence that's available. So certainly a question we wanted to ask on behalf of our wonderful Court TV viewers, because we're all wondering if it will be pursued. And according to him, this is something that is part of the equation. So they're going to evaluate whether or not they want to take that step and make that choice to pursue capital punishment. And who knows if we'll even get to that point, if it could be part of plea negotiations early on. Really too soon to tell, as this case is in the very early stages, Vinny. And there was supposed to be a scheduling conference on the case today that was postponed actually till July 7th. So we're watching it closely to see if anything gets scheduled for a hearing or even perhaps a plea agreement. Who knows?
All right, so nothing till July 7th. Of course, we'll continue to track it here, but you could get a scheduling conference, a plea conference, or that preliminary hearing where they reveal their evidence, and then maybe things get down to the nitty-gritty on death penalty, no death penalty, and maybe that's where a deal is struck, because the defense is cornered on this one. There's no way out. But
yeah, this